Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 2. Your Two Tens. The next morning, Tally arrived at the police department 45 minutes before the start of her shift. She told herself it was only so that she could share a ride with Abigail again, who was supposed to start working earlier that day. It totally wasn't, because she was sure that after the coffee fiasco, Detective Alder would skin her alive if she would manage to be late on her first actual day of work. Tally knew she was only delaying the unavoidable, and would give Alder a reason to do just that, sooner rather than later. But for today, she decided to play it safe. That was why the bullpen was almost empty when she entered the room together with Abigail. There were only a couple of detectives finishing up from the night shift. Tally quickly hugged Abigail goodbye, then the brunette went off to find her partner. Tally looked around the room, suddenly feeling slightly awkward and not quite sure what to do with her spare time. One of the older detectives, whose name she just couldn't seem to remember, was currently finishing up the paperwork from the night shift. She spotted Tally and sent a small smile her way, probably sensing that she was feeling a little bit lost. "Morning, Craven. You looking for Alder?" Tally returned a smile and raised her eyebrow in question. "She's here already?" The older detective only shrugged her shoulders. "She's usually the first one to arrive and the last one to leave this place. I think she wanted to head down to the shooting range. Why don't you join her? I'm sure she won't mind." Tally wasn't so sure about that. Still, she had nothing else to do. She decided to follow the suggestion and turned around to take the elevator down to the shooting range. When she stepped into the room, her eyes needed a moment to adjust to the dim light. She had briefly taken a look at the shooting range yesterday. The large room was completely empty, except for the different shooting stands and the targets in the distance. After some seconds, Tally could spot Detective Alder standing at one of the stands. She had her back turned to Tally and was currently adjusting something on her weapon. Tally still stood right beside the door, but instead of heading closer, took a moment to observe the older woman. Alder's hair was up in a high braid, her ears covered by hearing protectors. She was wearing blue jeans and a black tank top, something that Tally, for some reason, found annoyingly distractive. She couldn't help but notice the way the jeans hugged Alder's curves in the exact right places, and quickly found her eyes drawn to her bare arms. Tally unconsciously licked her lip. When the woman lifted her gun and the muscles in her arm visibly tensed, her eyes followed the movement of her fingers, which then quickly pulled the trigger 5 times before Alder lowered the gun again, pushed a button on the panel next to her, and waited until the target moved close enough for her to monitor her hit ratio. Even from the distance, Tally could see that she hadn't missed a single shot. The target now had 3 clear holes through the chest and 2 through the head. She shouldn't be surprised, but damn, this was impressive. Alder, however, didn't seem to be completely satisfied. She moved the target back into its original position, adjusted her posture ever so slightly, focused, only for the briefest of seconds, and quickly fired another 5 shots through the room. Tally watched Alder's shoulder drop after the last bullet hit its target. For some reason, Tally's attention was then grabbed by the way Alder's long, slender fingers were still wrapped around the gun, and the way she unconsciously moved them up and down the cold metal. Do you want to stand there all day or actually get some training done? Tally froze when Alder's unmistakable voice suddenly filled the room. How did she even notice her? She still had her back turned to Tally. Even though she knew that Alder couldn't see her, Tally guiltily turned her head to look in a different direction, as if she hadn't been standing there for the last 5 minutes gawping at her partner. Oh God, when had she noticed that Tally was here with her? One of the older detectives told me I'd find you down here, and I thought... I wasn't... Tally stuttered, desperately trying to avoid any further embarrassment. I didn't know you noticed me, and I didn't want to disturb... She abruptly stopped her awkward rambling mid-sentence, when Alder turned around and her brows furrowed in confusion. She had expected the older detective to look annoyed, angry even. Instead, she was smirking, and there was an almost playful sparkle in her eyes. No need to be embarrassed, Detective Craven. Tally truly hoped she imagined a slightly teasing tone in her voice. Now that you've spent some time with your detailed observation of my technique, I think it's time for you to demonstrate your own skills, don't you agree? No, she was definitely teasing her. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Tally wished the ground would open and swallow her. How the hell had she managed to get herself into such an embarrassing situation with Alder again? She quickly considered her options, but came to the conclusion that attack was her best, and quite frankly her only defense. Without another word, Tally turned around, grabbed a pair of hearing protectors, and walked to the stand next to Detective Alder. Then, she pulled her gun out of her belt, positioned herself, and loaded the weapon. Shooting practice had never been her favorite activity at the academy. It wasn't that she was lacking the talent to fire a gun. She had still been one of the best shooters in her class. Still, she could never really get used to the feeling of cold metal in her hand. She knew the gun was primarily there to protect her, but the thought of actually pointing it at people, hurting or even killing people with it, always caused an odd feeling in her stomach. She pushed the uneasiness away and reminded herself that this was just another exercise and that nobody would truly get hurt. However, the fact that she could feel Alder's presence beside her and knew the older detective was watching her didn't exactly help with her concentration. Still, Tally forced herself to focus. She straightened her back and aimed at the target in the distance. She breathed in, then out, and shot. Just like Alder before her, she fired a total of 5 shots before she lowered and secured her weapon, turned around, and pushed a button to move the target closer. Her hit ratio was quite all right. She had fired 2 shots directly into the center of the target, and the other 3 slightly out of her targeted area. Definitely nothing that she should be ashamed of. Alder, however, didn't seem so pleased with the result. Your foot positioning needs some work, and your shoulders are too tense. The teasing tone in her voice was gone and had gotten replaced by the strict, almost military drill tone that Tally had already gotten used to. Still, she could feel her stomach drop, so much for impressing Alder with her mediocre shooting skills. She looked down, awkwardly fidgeting with her weapon in her hands, but could see Alder move out of the corner of her eyes. Her whole body tensed again, when Alder confidently started to walk towards her and stopped right by her side, their bodies only inches apart. Tally didn't dare to move. What was she doing? Eyes up and open, Detective. Alder's low voice made Tally shiver involuntarily, and the fact that Alder was purposely invading her personal space didn't exactly make her situation any better. Her cheeks were burning already, in a way that not even the dim light of the room could hide. Still, she followed Alder's orders and lifted her head. Alder only hummed in approval. Tally could feel her moving even closer, could feel the swell of her breasts gently pressing into her back. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus and ignore the wave of arousal that was slowly beginning to grow inside of her. I said, eyes open. Tally's eyes snapped open again. How did you even see that? She hated herself for the clearly audible shaking of her voice, but Alder only chuckled in response. I feel it. Now, lift your weapon. Tally dumbfoundedly did, like she was told. She almost breathed out in relief when she could feel Alder slowly moving backward a moment later. The minimal touch of Alder's body was, however, quickly replaced by a warm hand, pressing firmly right between her shoulder blades. Tally couldn't help but lean into the touch, and her body automatically straightened itself. "You're too tense, Craven." Alder's voice was still barely more than a whisper, but every one of her words burned itself into Tally's mind. Her thoughts were spiraling, and she barely registered that Alder moved closer again. Her hand was now drawing tiny circles on her skin, and even though Tally felt like her whole body was on fire, she could slowly feel herself relax under Alder's touch. "There you go." Alder's hand wandered from her shoulders, down her outstretched arm, the feather-like touches leaving a trail of goosebumps behind, and stopped right above the elbow. "You need to stop seeing your gun as a simple piece of metal. Treat it like it's an extension of your arm. It's a part of you, and every tiny movement of your body influences the way it works." Tally was mesmerized by Alder's voice, and still, the words somehow made perfect sense to her. She could feel Alder retreating slightly, and even though her body was immediately missing the feeling of her warm fingertips, Tally didn't change her posture in the slightest. When she unloaded her gun, her movements were steady, her breathing calm, and her gaze focused on the task ahead of her. She fired another 5 shots, each of them hitting the target precisely where she wanted them to. A proud smile appeared on her face when the next 5 shots were just as good, but when she turned around, still beaming with pride, waiting for Alder's approval, the older detective was nowhere to be seen. Tally frowned in confusion and couldn't help a feeling of disappointment erupting in her stomach. But before Tally could truly give in to that feeling, her gaze landed on her watch. Shit. It was 8:03, which meant she was already 3 minutes late for morning briefing. Oh, for God's sake. Craven, you had one job this morning. She cursed quietly, dumped the hearing protector into a basket, then turned around and hurried out of the room. Tally managed to get onto the 3rd floor in record speed, and when she entered the bullpen, visibly out of breath, Captain Bellwether had only just finished greeting everyone. Still, when she entered the room, Tally could feel everybody's eyes on her, and the captain sent a disapproving glance in her direction. "Detective Craven, I'm so glad you decided to join us." Tally lowered her head, murmured a quick apology, and then quickly made her way through the room to her desk, where Detective Alder was already waiting, looking as put together as always. Not a single thing indicating that she must have hurried out of the room only minutes before Tally. As I was saying before our interruption, Tally could again feel several heads turn in her direction, as Captain Bellwether continued with her speech. "Today is looking quite busy." Petra Bellwether then turned in the direction of Abigail and Detective Quartermain, who were seated a couple of desks away from Tally. "Bellwether, Quartermain, you will stay here on standby for now. Be prepared to leave at any time. There seems to be quite a lot going on in the city today, and it's probably only a question of time until you will be requested somewhere." She went on with handing out assignments, and Tally used the time to put herself back together. She couldn't exactly explain what had happened down in the shooting range. It was difficult for her to place Alder's behavior. That teasing tone in her voice, the way she had felt her leaning into the contact with Tally's body. Had she been mocking her? Had she been genuinely trying to help? Whatever it was, Tally definitely had to find a way to deal with her body's strange reaction to Alder, or else it would only be a question of time until she would get herself into a potentially even more awkward situation. "Alder, Craven." Tally snapped out of her thoughts and lifted her head. Well, her attention span was definitely something else that needed work. "You will head out to the suburbs. There's a bit of a sensitive case waiting for you, and the local authorities specifically asked for someone who had experience in dealing with the media." Tally could feel Alder noticeably tensing up beside her when the captain mentioned the interest of the media. That was weird. Tally wouldn't have taken her for the type of person that had problems dealing with reporters and making public statements. Alder, however, did her best to hide her displeasure. She only looked at Captain Bellwether, her face completely blank. "Sensitive how?" Her voice sounded as firm as ever. If Tally hadn't noticed her body stiffen only seconds before, she would not have noticed that Alder was uncomfortable in any way. Homicide. The victim is Bonnie Creighton. Her husband, Shane Creighton, is an aspiring politician with quite a public reputation. Apparently, there has been a break-in into their house. Shane and Bonnie were at a party, but Bonnie left early and surprised the burglars. Didn't end too well for her. Alder only nodded, not showing any reaction, but Tally herself was struggling to hide the wave of adrenaline that was currently rushing through her body. Here it was, her first homicide case, and even one that looked like it had quite the public range. The car ride to the crime scene was silent. Alder had apparently decided to ignore their encounter at the shooting range earlier, so Tally simply did the same. She was sitting on the passenger seat, busying herself with looking out of the window, doing her best to ignore the presence of Alder beside her. Still, she was restless, and when they got closer to their destination, the nervous feeling in her stomach took the upper hand. Is there anything I need to pay special attention to when you're at the crime scene? It's kind of my first homicide, and I really don't want to mess anything up. You're going to be fine if you follow my lead. Stay close to me. Don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone. Without double-checking with me first. Especially not to anyone who even remotely looks like a reporter. They're vultures and will twist your words in your mouth if you aren't careful. Leave them to me. Tally gulped. Alder's words were not exactly reassuring. So when they arrived at the scene only a couple of minutes later, Tally was actually relieved to see a handful of people standing in front of the barrier, none of them particularly interested in the car that was just passing them. Apart from the police barrier outside, the house seemed completely normal. There were 2 cars in the driveway, a dark blue SUV in the front and the red Mini right behind it. The sprinklers were on and it looked almost peaceful, except for the group of police officers walking busily over the grounds. They left the car and immediately went inside, once they had presented their ideas to the officer's position at the front door. Inside the house, they were quickly greeted by a woman around Tally's age with brown hair. She only nodded grimly in Alder's direction, apparently not too pleased to see her, but then sent a warm smile in Tally's direction. Dr. Scylla Ramshorn, I don't think we've met before. I'm the medical examiner for Boston PD. Tally returned her smile. Great to meet you, Dr. Ramshorn. I'm Detective Tally Craven. She quickly nodded in Alder's direction. The +1. Dr. Ramshorn chuckled. Please, call me Scylla. She then seemed to switch back into professional mode and turned her head to Alder. The victim is Bonnie Creighton, female, 34 years old. She died around 2 a.m. last night, multiple stabbing wounds in her lower abdomen. Her husband called it in when he found her after he arrived a couple of hours later from the party. Alder only nodded, then turned around and started to walk in the direction of a man, talking to an officer at the end of the hallway. He was wearing a gray suit and was currently gesticulating wildly with his hands. Tally figured that he must be Shane Creighton, the husband. She followed Alder quietly, and while the other detective greeted him and offered her condolences, Tally held herself back and just listened to them for a while. Something about the man was putting her off. He was in his late 30s with short brown hair and a beard. So far, nothing unusual, but there was some sort of cold glint in his eyes that caused an uneasy feeling inside of Tally. Generally, he seemed quite collected, considering that he had just found his wife stabbed to death in his living room, but Tally figured that the realization probably still hadn't set in. Plus, the man was a politician, so he definitely knew how to put up a facade to hide his true feelings. It wasn't just the victim's husband that made Tally wary. She had had a weird feeling about this crime scene ever since they arrived. It's not like she had been to many murder scenes before, but something that she couldn't quite place yet just seemed off. She walked a couple of steps away from Alder into the living room and let her eyes wander through the room. Bonnie Creighton was lying on the floor, next to the large couch in the center of the room. A white cloth had been put over her. The rest of the room was a mess. One of the windows had been broken, and there was glass all over the floor. The wall safe stood was ajar, obviously opened with force. The pictures that had hidden it had just been carelessly thrown on the floor. The pillows of the couch had been spread throughout the room, drawers had been pulled open, and almost all picture frames on the shelves had been destroyed. The whole place looked exactly like someone would imagine it to look after a break-in. But that was exactly what made Tally pause. The chaos looked too organized, almost as if it had been staged. She looked around again, noticing more and more things that just didn't seem to fit the spontaneous break-in leading to accidental murder theory. While the pictures that had covered the wall safe was completely destroyed, all the other pieces of art were still in place. So either the burglar had been extremely lucky and had found the safe on the first try, or he had known exactly where to look. Tally hesitated and let her gaze wander over the clearly valuable vases that were decoratively placed throughout the room, various electronic devices that lay on the table, and a credit card that was left on one of the drawers. Why even bother with breaking into the safe in the first place, when the room was full of easily graspable items that had all been left behind? The burglar had clearly seemed to be in a rush. The ransacked drawers indicated as much. Yet, he went for the time-consuming safe, rather than easily accessible valuables, and above that, for some reason, took the time to destroy almost every photograph of Bonnie and Shane that had been placed on the shelves. This was not an ordinary break-in. This was something personal. Tally felt like she was onto something now. She slowly walked further into the room, closer to Bonnie's dead body. Her dead body was laying in the middle of the room. This again just didn't seem to make any sense. If Bonnie had really been surprised by a burglar when she entered the room, wouldn't her body lie closer to the door? Also, what kind of burglar brought a knife to a burglary these days? A gun, maybe, or even a taser. Or maybe they would have grabbed one of the pillows and suffocated Bonnie with it, or strangulated her with their bare hands. But a knife? No. Knife murders were usually personal. Plus, according to Scylla, Bonnie had been stabbed not only once, but several times, which sounded like murder with a motive, and not just an unfortunate meeting with a burglar. Tally chewed on her lip, trying to puzzle the pieces together, and when she looked out of the window and saw the two cars of Bonnie and Shane in the driveway, she suddenly realized what had bugged her, ever since she arrived. She turned on her heels and rushed back into the hallway, where Alder was still in deep conversation with Shane. Tally stepped closer and cleared her throat. "Not now, Craven." Alder held up her hand and shut her down before she even started speaking. Anger began to flare inside of Tally, and she reacted without thinking. She grabbed Alder's wrist and pulled her down the hallway and into the kitchen. The older detective was so surprised that she just stumbled after Tally without putting up any resistance. However, she quickly caught herself once they were inside the kitchen. She pulled herself free from Tally's grasp and looked at her in outrageous disbelief. "Craven, what the hell has gotten into you?" Tally took one deep breath, then lifted her head and looked at Alder almost boldly. "I think Shane Creighton has murdered his wife, and I can prove it." Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.